Hello and welcome back to the Simplifiers podcast, where we take topics in business and in life and simplify them. Now we're going to go a bit meta here, friends, because we're going to have a conversation about conversations. Because let's face it, you guys, if you're a business owner, if you run a company, no matter if it's teeny tiny or really, really big, I'm willing to bet that you have to talk to people in some way, shape, or form today in order for that business to exist and thrive. So let's break that down. Let's simplify that. My special guest today is Celeste Headlee, and she's an award-winning journalist, professional speaker, podcaster, and a best-selling author of 2 books, Herd Mentality and We Need to Talk, How to Have Conversations That Matter. In her 20-year career in public radio, I'm sure you've heard her on quite a few NPR favorite shows like Tell Me More, Talk of the Nation, All Things Considered, and Weekend Edition. She's been featured on Today, Time, Elle, BuzzFeed, and also her TEDx talk has been shared, 20 million times out there to date. You definitely want to listen to that one. It's 10 Ways to Have a Better Conversation. She's the co-host of PBS's new weekly series, Retro Report, that debuted this October, and the co-host for Season 3 of Seen on the Radio podcast with Men. I'd like to welcome to the Simplifiers podcast, Celeste Headlee. Hey, Celeste.
Good morning. How are you?
I am glad you're here. I am doing well. Let's talk about conversations because, so at the time of this recording, I have a 9-year-old and a nearly 11-year-old, and that means that I am constantly in a household of people who don't want to talk to me.
Right? Yeah.
And so that's my home life. And then in my business, well, I'm kind of like you. I talk to a lot of people on the podcast, and I have a lot of conversations. But there are some times where I go, I just want to crank out a text. Let's just do this via email because I don't want to deal with the aftermath of having that big, scary phone conversation. Why are phone conversations so tricky for people these days?
You know, it's odd. I mean, number one of the reasons they're so tricky is because we're avoiding them. So the fewer phone conversations you have, the more your skills in that area will degrade. Mm-hmm. I guess people don't seem to realize that your skill as a conversationalist can degrade. But, if you haven't gone swimming for a really long time, you're not going to be as good a swimmer. And if you haven't made lasagna in a long time, your lasagna, you probably need to check the recipe. And it's the same thing with your conversational skills, right? Like some of it is innate, but a lot of it is just practice. So that's one thing. The other thing is that texting and email is easier because we don't have to deal with another person, right? Mm-hmm. We don't have to deal with them not understanding what we're saying. We don't have to deal with pushback. The problem is it gives us a delusion of an effective communication. It's a delusion because you feel you've communicated effectively because there's zero feedback.
Right.
Right? You do not see the confusion on their face. So you're like, well, this is clear. Mm-hmm. I would understand this. And so you feel like you've communicated clearly when in fact you have not. The number one cause of project failure, by the way, in business is poor communication. One of the most common reasons for poor communication is overuse of email.
Mm-hmm. Because you don't understand the inference, you don't see the body language or the nonverbal cues that are coming down the pipeline. And I'm willing to bet, I'll be the first one to raise my hand here. I sometimes will put it in an email or a Slack message because I'm like, I just want to document that I said this on this date and this time, and then, there's the proof. It's not a good idea, right?
Well, it's okay. That's all right. I oftentimes will make a call and then I'll send a follow-up email saying, hey, here's what we talked about.
Yeah.
Right? The other thing I want to say is that there are plenty of times when text and email is okay. If all you're doing is relaying straightforward information, what do you want to have for dinner? Chinese food? Great. Mm-hmm. See you at 6?
Yep.
Fine.
Yep.
Text is perfect. I generally have a rule of 3 exchanges and then I call. So if there's 3 back and forths, I'm like, okay, when do you have 5 minutes to talk on the phone?
Yeah.
And then I get on the phone. And then if I need to record it, then I will send that follow-up email saying, this is what I heard. And then if they write back and say, wait, that's not what I said, then I call them again. You have to sort of figure out what email and texting is good at and use it for that. And everything else should be done on the phone.
Okay, so Celeste, then if we don't communicate via text and email, which is, what people are really prone to do nowadays. It's like the easy route, like pushing the big red F it button and going, oh, easy, right? But what are the consequences in your mind of sending the email and taking it off your to-do list instead of actually picking up the phone and having the conversation or actually walking over to their office and doing the thing?
It's a great way to phrase it about consequences because there are a lot of them. Let's just start with your business consequences.
Yeah.
And the costs of poor communication, miscommunication in global businesses is in the billions. So your emails, you cannot lead through email. You are causing all kinds of misconceptions. There was one story that where somebody sent an email saying, "Hey, can you rework that report for this afternoon's meeting? Can you get it done by 4?" And the person sent back another email saying, "Absolutely." And at 4:00 turned in a report and it was the wrong one.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So that's one of the things in email. You're not standing there in front of them. You are not communicating as clearly. So that's one consequence. But there's another hidden consequence, which is the fact that email and texting do not fulfill the social needs that human beings have. And you might think this has nothing to do with business, but in fact, loneliness costs businesses billions, perhaps trillions of dollars, because loneliness is horribly debilitating to the human mind. In fact, Atul Gawande, the great brain surgeon, has said that the effects of loneliness are similar to those of a traumatic brain injury. When you feel lonely, you are more prone to errors. Not surprisingly, you're going to take more sick days. If the people in your life that you take care of are lonely, you're going to end up having to take days to care for them. But there's all kinds of things that begin to break down. Your cortisol levels go up. You're in anxiety mode all the time. Business begins to break down. And if all you're doing is sending emails all day, your brain does not interpret that as social contact. And a human being needs a certain amount of social contact every day. So you need to see people's faces and hear their voices.
Which is so true, because if you think about it, I mean, more and more businesses nowadays are working remote. They're, employees, you're not in the same office together. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners are nodding their head right now going, yep, that's me. I work from home and I got a handful of virtual assistants out in the world who I never see face to face. Like, you really have to be intentional about creating these conversations. So do you suggest like maybe regular check-in calls with your team, or actually, putting something in the calendar where that you have to meet in person X number of times a month, a year? What would you suggest?
All of the above, whatever works for you. Frankly, there's really not a huge diminution of benefit when you're using teleconferencing. I'm looking at you right now, and in fact, my brain interprets this as social contact.
Yeah.
Right. If the ideal is face to face, this is a very, very close second, followed shortly by on the phone. So if all that you can do is either teleconference like we're doing, or getting them on the phone, absolutely go ahead.
Yeah.
Do that, and find the time, make it regular. And frankly, look, I freaking hate conference calls. I hate them. And yet, thank God I force myself to do them with my team every other week, because that's what really keeps us together as a team. Not only that, but when you're discussing things, that's when people are more likely to bring something up that they may think is not important. And then suddenly you discover somebody has some knowledge or some idea that, because it's not under their job duties, I had no clue that they had that at their disposal. So it's also one of the best ways to innovate, because you're getting people's real in-time reactions.
And it's so true too, because I'm based in the UK, and we have a minister of loneliness. We have somebody in the parliament that is specifically his job, is to cure loneliness on the whole in the country. So I can imagine, as more and more small business owners or freelancers are sparking out and doing their own thing, working from their own little box at their home office or a co-working space, they're not connecting in real life with people. And like you said at the top of the episode, we're forgetting how to talk.
Yeah, and the other problem is that people sometimes confuse talking with conversing
Mm.
because they're not the same. You might be a really great talker, you might be interesting and funny and engaging. That doesn't mean you're good in conversation because conversation requires you to show true curiosity for another person,
Mm.
and be able to have the kind of focus that allows you to not let your mind wander while someone else is talking.
Mm.
So very often, Stephen Covey said, we're always listening not with the intent to understand, but with the intent to reply.
Mm-hmm.
And very often we'll only hear the first 10, 15 seconds of what somebody says. Then it makes us think of what it is we want to say, and we do not hear anything else they say.
Mm-hmm.
If that's what you're doing, first of all, it's okay. It's what most people are doing.
Yeah.
Second of all, you're not actually conversing because a conversation is a mutual exchange of ideas. So if you have learned nothing from that other person by the end of the conversation, you haven't had a conversation.
Yeah, and it's a volley, right? Like in tennis, you're volleying the ball back and forth. Is there a way then to go into a conversation and be more prepared, like to set a goal? I remember reading a bit about that in your book.
Yeah, I mean, one of the first goals, people, when you're preparing for, say, an important conversation, what do? You write down what you're going to say.
Mm-hmm.
Um, But as a journalist, what I do is I write down what questions I want to ask.
Yeah.
What is it I want to hear from the other person? What do I want to learn from them? And frankly, that's almost a better idea. You can do both, and I suggest doing both, but it is just as important to figure out what it is you need to learn from them as it is to know what you're going to say. Keep in mind, one of the most important lessons that we've learned from the Harvard Negotiation Project, for example, is that most conflicts are caused by conflicting stories. So if I have a conflict with you, it's because my story does not include all the stuff I can't know. It
Mm-hmm.
can't include the stuff that happened to you or the things going on with you that I have no way of knowing. So if you go into conversation understanding that all you know is your own story,
Yeah.
and then going to hear their story as well so you can create that complete picture, that's a great way to handle any conversation, conflict or not.
Mm-hmm. It makes a lot of sense. And so, what would you say are the ingredients of a great conversation? One that's mutual and, volleying back and forth. Could you break that down for us?
Yeah, so a great conversation just needs to be that mutual exchange,
Mm-hmm.
which means A, there needs to be turn taking, and it can't be overextended turn taking, right? Like there's a lot of people who will hold that podium for way too long and they're basically holding the other person hostage. So a great conversation is a reasonable amount of turn taking in a short amount of time. Keep in mind, you don't have a lot of people's attention.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're telling a long story, you can interrupt that story and allow the other person to engage and respond. Another thing about a great conversation is that both people walk away having learned something from the other. There's three kinds of listening. There's evaluative listening, which is basically where you are just listening to the extent that you're trying to figure out if you agree with them or
Mm-hmm.
figure out if they're right or wrong. That's the most shallow, superficial listening you can get. Then there's interpretive listening, which is where you're trying to understand. You're really trying to understand what it is that they're saying. And the final kind of listening is transformative. Transformative listening is where you're actually open to changing your mind.
Mm-hmm.
That's where you are open to being changed by the conversation. Not every conversation is going to be able to be transformative. Your little chat with your coworker in the hallway probably will not transform you.
Yeah.
So most of your conversations, I would say, I hope that they're in the interpretive category where you're at least really trying and focusing on understanding.
Mm. And it makes me think about the current political, just the reality of where we are. I live in the UK. It's not much better over here. Let's just be real. You live
Nope.
in the US. I mean, so there is such a polarization of thoughts and beliefs out there. And I remember in your book, you mentioned, because we are so dramatically polarized right now, that there's so many people that are coming to the table going, oh, I can never believe you. I can never even have a conversation with you. It's like you just shut down before you even begun. I mean, what are your thoughts on how we stop that from happening, but actually be open to having conversations with people that you're like, I don't get you, I don't understand you, and you are so far from my bubble.
So there's two things here. First of all, you have to understand that you can learn from every single person, no matter how much you disagree with them. Listening to someone is not an endorsement.
Yeah.
Listening to someone is about understanding. It's not about endorsing. So that's the first thing. You can learn from that other person. And the other thing I would say is that, frankly, I think our technology is a huge part of the problem here. And the reason I say that is because recent research, like within the past couple of years, has shown that, in fact, there is something about the quality and tone of the human voice that allows us to humanize each other. So there's an interesting study that Celeste Headlee and his colleagues did, in which they presented to people an opinion they disagreed with, and they presented it in several forms. Sometimes they would read that opinion, and sometimes they would hear someone voicing it. It turns out that if you read an opinion you disagree with in any form, a book, a newspaper, online, you're more likely to think that person disagrees because they're stupid and they don't understand the core concepts. If you hear them saying that in their voice, you're more likely to think they disagree because they have different perspectives and experiences. And what this means is that there is something about the sound of the human voice, which we are so evolutionarily and biologically designed to respond to, that it is the voice itself that humanizes us to each other. It is the human voice that allows me to recognize you as a human being with your own thoughts and your own experiences in life. And our brain doesn't click over into the empathic. If you take your finger and you put it at the top of your right ear, move it up and down an inch and move it back about an inch, that's the center which is not engaged by writing. And that's just for broad strokes. Let's just call that your empathy center, right? It's not, but let's just, use the most, this is basically your compassion. And it is not engaged when you read. So the more we avoid hearing each other's voices, and we're avoiding it a lot, the more we will dehumanize one another.
And I think that's where I feel like your TEDx talk has gone viral because of this. That's where I feel like we as a society and a culture need to hear this message and need to be gently reminded about it, of how important conversations are, because the flip side of that is that we continue to sit in our bubble, right? And, Facebook doesn't, help really, because Facebook continues to just give us back more of people in our bubble, talking to each other and, continuing to believe, well, I'm the right side and everybody else is wrong and blah, blah, blah. Look at all of those guys over there. And I think that we're coming to a head as a culture that we need to, again, remember how to communicate, but then also, again, remember how to break out of our bubbles so that we can expand our perspectives on what's happening on the world as a whole, right?
Yeah, and there's a couple reasons this really applies in business. The first is that one of the solutions many managers have is to just ban talking about politics at the workplace. This does not work, because basically all that you're doing is clamping down on conversation, which is going to actually raise tensions and cause more problems rather than solve any. In fact, the number one cause of merger failure or acquisition failure is organizational silence, meaning the topics that people are not talking about because they're afraid of conflict. It is much more efficient to train your employees in how to have those conversations without fighting. Way better. The other thing I would say that it applies to business is that as you become, social media and email stuff will tend to polarize you and push you towards the extremes. What that means is that you are less likely to take advantage of the innovative ideas and creative problem solving that you have at your disposal with your team members. What's the point of hiring incredible people if you're not actually listening to them and hearing their ideas as valid and credible, rather than going, oh no, we can't do that. That sounds ridiculous. It may sound ridiculous, but it may also be that step forward. Kodak invented streaming and chose not to pursue it because they thought it would hurt their core business. Right. So, and there's story after story about this. On the other hand, you have Netflix, which when streaming began to come up, they did not reject that, saying, hey, we're a business that sends out DVDs.
In the mail.
They went, yeah, let's do both of them. And you see how it went the other way. So there's a couple real dangers just in business, and I think it's pretty clear how this can really hurt you at home. There's people who are not seeing their family members anymore, who are staying home at Christmas and Thanksgiving and on holidays because some family member voted for Trump and won't stop talking about that, and some member voted for Bernie, and and so they've stopped actually seeing one another.
Right.
That is crazy to me.
Right. And I remember reading in your book, which, side note, if you guys are curious, go to the show notes for this episode at thesimplifierspodcast.com and click through the links for all the resources that we're talking about today, including Celeste's book, We Need to Talk. In your book, you really mentioned that a great conversation is built on brevity, but efficiency and, balance with careful and healthy amounts of listening. And you also mentioned honesty are some key things that you need in a conversation. So how do we make that actually happen? Because, I think about conversations as there's low risk ones, like what are we going to eat for dinner tonight? And then there's high risk ones. Are we going to do this or not? How do you traverse that carefully?
Yeah, so one of the most important things is to figure out what it is you're trying to do in that conversation. Sometimes we go into conversations just to we want the other person to admit that we're right.
Ugh. And the worst.
And I think that actually happens more often than people will admit.
Totally.
Especially in business conversations, where the whole purpose of that conversation is for everyone to acknowledge that you were right all along, or that your idea is the best one. Those are not great conversations. I would choose not to have those, or to change your goal. So it's very important that you're clear and honest with yourself going in on what is my goal here. What is it I'm trying to accomplish? Mm-hmm. And the other thing is that make sure it's a shared goal, right? If you're bringing someone else into that conversation, make sure the goal is shared. Obviously, I'm not talking about a conversation in which you're reporting abuse. With some of these more extreme and very high stakes conversations, those are sort of a different category altogether.
Right.
But in your normal course of your life, those are the conversations that we're talking about. I already mentioned that you should go in figuring out what it is you want to learn from the other person. But I also want to say, when it comes to honesty, we pretty much recognize, we can see in someone's face and body language when they're either don't want to be having the conversation, when they want to escape, when they're not entirely telling us the truth. Human beings are actually quite accurate at knowing when deception is occurring. We're just not accurate at all at knowing which thing is not true. So if somebody talks to us for 5 minutes, we're like, something in there wasn't true. We just don't know which. So we know this about ourselves, but we fail to realize that other people have the same skill. So we sometimes practice deception and think we're fooling people. You are not. They know something's wrong. And if you do that too often, even if what you're hiding is silly and superficial, all they're getting is a sense that something's not true. That's all they're getting.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and that's what I would call is my intuition, right? Like when I see somebody not keeping a gaze of eye contact or flying from the conversation, like, oh, I gotta go. That is bing, 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 red alert. Something is not right here, right?
Right. And we mostly assume the worst. We don't think, oh, they have, a stomach problem today and they're probably running to the bathroom. Right. We don't assume like the best of someone's intentions. Yeah. We always go directly to bad.
Yeah.
And so we have to realize that other people are doing the same thing that we're doing. So it is better to just simply be honest. If you can't tell someone something, say, hey, listen, I can't tell you that right now. And I apologize. As soon as I'm free to do so, I will do so. That is much better than talking around it when it comes to honesty.
Yeah, or skirting the issue altogether.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I had to chuckle, and I have to point this out. If you've not seen our TEDx talk, you have to watch it, because I think it was about 5 minutes in. You say, right, all those good tips about like being a good listener is make eye contact, nod your head, say which I'm now starting to be like a little bit like nervous that you're judging me and my conversation skills today.
Not judging you.
Side note, but you say, well, scrap all that because that is just garbage. What do we do, Celeste, if we don't do those things? What do you advise us?
Okay, so what ended up happening, this is, I'm assuming, having read all of those books, so you don't have to, is I think that what happened was people sat down and said, okay, this is a really great conversation. What's happening in this conversation? And they went, oh, they're maintaining eye contact and they're saying, and they're making arm gestures, et cetera, et cetera. So they said, okay, if you do those things, make arm gestures and say, then you'll have a great conversation. That is incorrect.
Yeah.
All you're doing is focusing on the sort of symptoms of the disease, right? That is not right. All it does is distract people from listening, which is truly what's at the heart of a great conversation. If you are listening to someone and actually engaged, you will naturally maintain eye contact and take turns and make gestures and say, Those things will happen without you even trying to do so. So you don't have to worry about that at all. And by focusing on those things, again, you have not been focusing on the thing that is A, the hardest, and B, the most essential, which is to listen. Mm-hmm. Listening is hard for us as Homo sapiens. We're not great at it. Mm-hmm. We don't, if you have two children, you know that when some tiny human comes out of the womb, listening is not their best skill.
Screaming is.
Right. Well, and it makes sense, right? There are some species that need to be able to listen to survive. Human babies need help. So screaming and getting the attention of an adult, that's how they survive. We don't always develop that skill. Some people are using screaming as their tactic for the rest of their lives, right? So which is all to say that you're gonna have to work at it. There's not gonna be some point at which you're like, okay, I've mastered listening, done with having to work at that. It's never gonna be easy.
I'm curious for you, Celeste. You interview people all day long with your work, just the same as me. Like, I find I'm a better listener, and this sounds so cliche, but it really, truly is the truth. I'm a better listener. I'm better at this when I get a good night's rest. I am well hydrated. I am filling my tank first as a person, as a human, and making sure that when I show up to an important conversation, it's the best version of me, not the perfect version, but the best version of me today. And that's when I feel like, I really nailed that. It's on those days when I feel good about it. Is it for you?
Oh, absolutely. And, this is one of the things of make setting the scene properly. Mm. If you're going to have a difficult conversation with an employee, for example, not only when is your best time, when are you at your most patient and able to listen, but when is theirs?
Yeah.
But the other thing, one of the later chapters, I think it's almost one of the last chapters, is called Maybe We Shouldn't Talk, which is to say that if you are not in the right frame of mind to be able to listen to somebody, walk away. Say, hey, listen, I am frazzled and I'm not going to be able to give you the focus you deserve. Let's put a pin in this. Give me an hour. Give me till tomorrow. Give me 30 minutes. Just let me get myself together. Mm. I don't necessarily want you to have more conversations, although that would be great. But what I want is for all of the conversations to be good ones, even if they are 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So if you can't do that, take some time.
Well, and I appreciate that's good advice, because I think if you are in the flight, fight, or freeze mentality and your modus operandus is to fly and get away and escape, yes, that's fine. But as long as you do tell the other party when you're going to come back and have this conversation, because I think what gets really frustrating for the rest of us who are not flight mentality people is we go, oh, geez, he did it again. He's skirting the really important conversation. And I just wish we could nail it down and have a conversation and decide on whatever it is. Say, hey, it's going to be 30 minutes from now. Hey, let's talk at 10 a.m. tomorrow. That's huge.
Yeah, and one of the most common complaints about managers is that they don't listen. And then the managers push back and say, "Hey, I have meetings with you all the time and I listen." But honestly, if all you're doing is sitting there while they talk and what they say to you changes nothing, it doesn't change your policy, it doesn't garner a response, then you're not actually listening.
Yeah.
So you have to set yourself up to be a successful listener. At the same time, you're thinking about how to set them up to be at their best as a communicator.
That's true. I mean, it comes back to leadership styles. I had learned a long time ago that, different types of leaders are an autocrat, a democrat, or laissez-faire. Autocrat is like, Celeste, do this now, do it by 10 a.m., done. There's no discussion here. Democratic is, okay, Celeste, I really could use your help in doing this task. What do you think about it? Do you think it's the best mode? Or laissez-faire is like, Celeste, this thing needs to be done. You do it, whatever. If it gets done, like, am I simplifying it down too much, or is that pretty much it?
No, I mean, basically, I mean, obviously it's more complicated than that, but everything is. I mean, your whole podcast is trying to simplify stuff down, right? And I think that's as fair as any other. Plenty of successful managers are a combination of those qualities, right? They know when to let someone alone. They know when to be more strict, and I think that the best managers know their employees well enough to know when they need to be which kind of manager.
Yeah, and shift and adjust based on the day or the location or the urgency of what's on their plate at that moment. In an earlier conversation, Celeste, you had mentioned that you like to do what are called untouchable days. Tell us what that means and how's that help you to become a better communicator?
So usually Mondays, I take an untouchable day, which means I neither look at or respond to email, and I don't look at social media. And I actually don't answer texts either. If you want to talk to me, you have to call on those days. And it's just so freaking freeing. It's like it feels as though there was more hours in that day. And I get so much done. I just feel so much more relaxed. I turn on a vacation responder, which says it's my untouchable day. I'm not answering email. If it's urgent, just call me. And frankly, in 2 years' time, no one has ever called. Which, we get this sense that if we don't check our email, there's an emergency we're going to miss. But we forget that people took care of business in their lives for a very long time without email. Like, it's okay. It's going to be fine. But, I'll walk out of the house without my cell phone. It's okay. Nothing explodes. Everyone survives. And I just get more done during the day. It's like you have more hours when you're not distracted by these stupid messages they're not urgent. They don't need to be answered right away. The stuff that you get involved in on Twitter that just distracts you and you fall down that rabbit hole. Untouchable days are just refreshing. In my next book that comes out in March, one of the things I write about is this January, I took a 2-week train trip all the way around the entire country. And there's a lot of places where the train goes, like right through Glacier National Park, where there's no cell signal. And I got to say that the first few times it happened where I looked at my phone and I had no signal, I panicked, right? There's this like, but then I was like, what the hell am I going to do? I'm on a train.
Right.
Like, it's okay. So that by the time I finally was on that last train coming down from Boston to home, I felt like a different person. And if you can give yourself that once every week, and I know that everybody's initial reaction is, that's not possible. I can't do that. You actually can.
Yeah.
You actually can.
Just test it. I mean, I think I have started to do this in my own life. And I tell you, it is fascinating what your brain conjures up as this is a hard and fast rule. I must have this in order to do this. And this is where I'm at, age 41 at time of recording of this podcast. I'm starting to question these hard and fast rules, because are they in fact true? Are they in fact helping you to thrive as a business owner? Are they in fact helping your mental health? So I love that idea of doing an Untouchable day, and test it for a week or a month and just see how it goes. I know for me, when I stopped checking my phone on certain days and certain times and, turning it off, gasp, not having it in my pocket, it's just a panic moment. It really, truly is. But it takes repetition, like anything, in order to truly simplify it like that.
And it will be self-rewarding. I mean, it does lower your cortisol levels when you stop worrying about that phone.
Yeah.
So even if you start with just half a day, I would just say, even if you start with an hour, shut down your email for an hour every day. Try it out.
Yeah, you might notice significant changes for the positive in your business and in your productivity as well. So I want to just put a quick pin in the map on something you said earlier on in our conversation, and that was about the power of your own voice. Now, when you actually have phone conversations with people, you're hearing their voice, they are hearing yours. Can you talk a little bit more about how we can really cultivate the power of our own voice, especially as like a business owner? How important is that?
Oh, it's really important. Every study that we've done has just proven more and more and more how incredibly informative the voice is, how much information we get from that voice. I'll just tell you about a couple of studies. For example, if you are trying to persuade someone or asking for a favor or asking an employee to do something, it's a terrible idea to put that in email. They've tested this again and again, where people have predicted overwhelmingly that an email is more persuasive. But then when they actually put the pedal to the metal and actually test it, it turns out the emails are almost statistically 0% persuasive. Mm-hmm. People are very capable of saying no to an email, but their voice, they are way more likely to say yes to your actual voice. And let me talk then about apologies also, because with apologies, moving from I'm sorry to I forgive you and we can move on is a both a neurological and a physiological process, which is relatively complicated. And it begins in that part of the brain I was talking about earlier. So we know the process has begun when this part of the brain lights up, your compassion center. So almost everybody chooses to send apologies through email. So they've tested it when someone reads an apology versus hearing it. So the reason we send apologies in email is because it's so much easier, right? But it turns out when someone reads an email or even a handwritten note, although there's a little wiggle room there, this part of the brain never lights up, ever. No activity, meaning that whole process never begins. You might as well have never said, I'm sorry. But when you're saying it to someone either face-to-face or on the phone, it's hard and we're struggling and we don't know what to say. And they see that or hear that and then suddenly, bing, the compassion center of their brain lights up and the process begins moving towards, I forgive you, let's move on. So there's just a couple examples of how important it is to hear someone's voice.
And it reminds me of, again, courage. It really takes courage in you to be bold and step out and have that conversation with somebody, even if it's super awkward and super hard. Like just to be bold and do the thing and put yourself in that situation, because in fact, you might save time, you might save money, and let's say that employee leaves and you have to spend all the money to replace them and headhunt another person and train them up. You'll save yourself a lot of grief as well if you actually just be bold and courageous and pick up the phone or schedule an in-person meeting.
It's the effort that gives it value. When you take out the effort and make it effortless, you also make it valueless.
So again, I highly recommend you guys. The book is excellent. It's out there wherever books are sold. It's called We Need to Talk, How to Have Conversations That Matter. We'll put the link in the show notes for everyone to want to check that out. And then again, we would love to have you back to talk about your new book coming out in 2020, which you guys keep on the radar. It's called Do Nothing, How to Break Away from Overworking, Overdoing, and Underliving. That's pretty much right up the Simplifiers alley. So we're definitely going to have you back then to talk about that one.
Awesome. I'd be glad to talk about it. I'm excited about it.
Great. So a couple of questions for you as we wrap up that I like to ask everybody that comes onto the podcast. First and foremost, what's one book or blog that you're reading these days that you just feel is really inspiring or maybe even poking holes and challenging your belief system these days?
So this book is a couple years old. I think it came out in 2017, but one that just kind of blew my mind is called The Knowledge Illusion: Why We Never Think Alone. And, I consider myself to be a fairly smart person, but that sort of blew holes in what I understood about the way we think. Human beings are a hive mind. We don't think very well alone. We're not logical. We're not particularly rational thinkers, but the way that we help each other break away from that, we're emotional and social thinkers, right? Meaning that we do our best thinking when we are in groups, rather than the lonely genius, which is a myth.
Yeah.
So that book was really great for laying that out and laid out the science also in a way that's totally understandable and readable.
Excellent. Well, we'll put a link in the show notes for that book as well if people want to check that out. And tell us, Celeste, who's one person in your network, somebody that you know just is up to brilliant things right now, and we could shine a spotlight on them. And who knows, maybe one day we'll interview them on the podcast as well.
So I would say take a look at Seema Yasmin, Dr. Seema Yasmin, who's British. She's a lot of stuff. I think she's a journalist she won an Emmy, I think. She's an author. She's an epidemiologist. She wrote a book called The Impatient Dr. Lang, which is about the guy who was like the most brilliant fighter against HIV. And he went down on that airplane that was shot down by pro-Russian rebels in 2014, I think.
Wow.
Totally great book, but she's involved in so many things in terms of telling you how to take in information in a way, how to read science, how to trust people. Also, she's a Muslim woman of color. She talks a lot about how we talk about racism. She's brilliant on so many fields. She has a TED Talk too, so TEDx Talk also. So she's great. Seema Yasmin.
Brilliant. Well, we'll link her as well. So if you guys are curious, you can check her out also. So I believe gratitude and simplicity go hand in hand. Tell me, what's one thing you're grateful for these days in your life?
Well, I got to tell you, I bought a house again. I've been renting for years since my last house, and I bought a house in April. And it was so funny because before I moved back to Maryland, I got rid of pretty much everything in my house. I emptied my house, and so I started from scratch. And I sat down in my living room one day and I looked around me and I loved everything that I could see. Everything within my eyesight was something I'd chosen and I loved it. And I thought, I wish everybody could have this feeling. Yeah. I wish it for everyone, because I am so grateful for a space that is just made for me. I mean, it's just brings me joy every single, not to call up Marie Kondo, but just everything inside my house makes me happy.
I love that. And I think that is the truth behind simplifying, is realizing that more stuff, more things, doing more doesn't always equal better, bigger, more joy, So simplifying down is all about putting things into your space, both in your home and into your head, that with intentionality and with love. I think that that's the key of it. I love it.
I agree.
So again, people can find you online at celesteheadlee.com, and these links can be found in the show notes. Is there anywhere on social media that you like to hang out the most and people can connect with you there?
I mean, I'm on Twitter a lot. I've had to sort of cut it down to only 2 or 3 times a day because it will take all my life. Yeah. And if you follow me on Instagram, you're going to see a lot of dog photos. So there you go.
Choose your poison accordingly. Yeah,
exactly.
We'll put those links in the show notes for you. So if you guys want to connect with Celeste, you can find her there. So my last question for you today is this, Celeste. And again, thank you for your time. I think that this is important stuff. And it's something that we skirt over like, oh, yeah, we know how to talk. Oh, whatever, but it's not about talking. It's about conversing and communicating. So let's say someone somewhere out there in the world, I'm willing to bet, is listening to this episode right now, and she has got a really hard conversation that she has to have in, say, I don't know, an hour from now, and she's sweating it. What's one thing that you could whisper into her ear right now just to encourage her in this moment?
I would say, okay, so here's what I'd say. Number one, real quickly, just go in with short, simple questions. Questions are so powerful and they will relieve the pressure off of you. But the other thing I would say is there was this great study that was done just last year called the liking gap. And basically, scientists followed people in conversations and relationships that were short, relationships with strangers, relationships with someone they lived with for a year. And here's what they discovered. You know how to do this. Human beings naturally take turns and respond and maintain eye contact. We do all of those things naturally. It is your biological superpower. It is your evolutionary inheritance. You don't have to worry about it. Don't get caught up in your head. You know how to do this. And the other thing they found is that people like you more than you think. And they enjoy your conversation more than you realize. So you got this. It's okay.
Celeste, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure. Thanks for talking to me.